We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara from Mesechet Shekalim. This is Shekalim Daf 10a. And the previous summer, Rabbi Yossi said in the Mishnah that if he wants, he can donate his time to be a shomer chinam on the svichim, which is the grain that grows on its own during the Shemitah year. The person can be a shomer chinam to protect that grain in order that it can be used for the omer and the shtei halechem. And the Chachamim now respond to Rabbi Yossi and they say, how can you be a shomer chinam? How could it be we don't pay the person? We have to pay the person because mishal tzibor, because these karbanos, the omer and the shtei halechem, have to come from the public. And if a person's going to be a shomer chinam, then he's basically going to take possession of this grain, and it's going to be a problem that it's going to be a private carbon. So on the contrary, the Chachamim say, no, you have to pay him from the trumas haleshka. You have to pay from the public funds in order that it can be a carbon mishal tzibor. And the Gemara says, ma'roz man atze kohanim v'ha'om. Why is it that the Mishnah Mesechet Shekalim has 9 times where specific families donate wood for the Mizbeach? Can't anyone just donate wood for the Mizbeach at any time? What's special about these particular times in the Mishnah in Mesechet Shekalim? And the Gemara explains, at the time the Klal Yisrael was coming up from the exile, meaning in the times of Ezra and Nehemiah when they were coming to build the second Beis HaMikdash, they didn't find any wood in the chamber. They were out of wood. And these particular families stood up. They donated wood on their own. They gave it to the public. And they brought with that wood, they brought the karbanos, the public karbanos. And at that time, the Nevi'im who were among them, they made a condition with them. That even in a situation, even in a time when the chamber was full of wood, and people from these families would get up and they would donate their own wood, that the karbanos should not be brought except from their wood first. That's what the Mishnah is referring to in Mesechet Shekalim. And so the Gemara continues, Rabbi Acha says to Rabbi Yossi, you should know that this Mishnah in Tainus seems to follow the opinion of Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah. To Rabbi Yossi Omer, because what does Rabbi Yossi say in our Mishnah? That's exactly what he says. He says if a person wants, they could be a shomer chinam on the svichim, on that grain which is going to be used in the Shemitah year for the omer and the shtei halechem. And apparently it's not a problem that it comes from a private individual, according to Rabbi Yossi. So that's the same thing over here. The wood that's donated can be donated by these private families, even though it's being used for karbanos tzibor. So that's Rav Acha's opinion, that this idea that the wood can be donated privately has to follow the position of Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah. However, the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi b'shem Rabbi Eila divrei hakolhi. Rabbi Yossi says in the name of Rabbi Eila that no, everybody would agree, even the Chachamim in our Mishnah, who say it's a problem to have the person be a shomer chinam, that's already a problem, would agree that in this case by the wood, it's not a problem to have a private donation. Why? Because ma pligin begufa shel carbon. Because the whole machlokas in our Mishnah is, when you're talking about the actual grain of the carbon, we're talking about the actual carbon ha'omer, the actual shtei halechem, then it's an issue. Then the Chachamim say it's an issue if it's owned by a private individual. Avol b'machshirei carbon, but when you're talking about the machshirei carbon, meaning the things that are necessary to prepare a carbon, for example, the wood that is being used to create the fire on the Mizbeach, kolam modi, there everybody agrees, shu mishtane carbon yochid the carbon tzibor, that something that is originally a yochid that belongs to a private individual can be donated to the Beis HaMikdash, can be used for a carbon tzibor in that situation. And the Gemara says similarly, Tani, it was taught, Isha sha'asta ksones levana, let's say a woman makes the ksones on behalf of her son who is the Kohen Gadol. So again, this is going to be like a private donation that is made for the public service of the Kohen Gadol. So you have the same type of situation in this case. So the Brisa says, Ksheira, that's perfectly fine. She just has to donate it that it belongs to the public. She can make it privately, donate it for public use, and then again it can be used for the Kohen Gadol in the service on Yom Kippur. So Gemara says the same exact machlokas amoraim on this. Amar Rabbi Acha says, Rabbi Yossi, again, this follows the opinion of Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah. The Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi says, a person can be a shomer chinam, a person can volunteer to watch the svichim that will be used again for the omer and the shtei halechem. And again, the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi b'shem Rabbi Eila. However, Rabbi Yossi says in the name of Rabbi Eila, divrei hakoli, no, everybody agrees when it comes to the begodim of the Kohen Gadol, it can be donated by the mother, because ma pligin, because what's the machlokas in our Mishnah again, begufa shel carbon, that's talking about the carbon itself. itself. But the things that are in preparation for the carbon, the clothing in this case that the Kohen Gadol is wearing, everybody agrees that again the same thing, that which is donated by a private individual can be used as a carbon sibor. And the Gemara continues, Masnisa pligi al Rabbi Yossi. The following brisa argues on Rabbi Yossi, meaning from the following brisa we're going to see that everybody agrees when it comes to machshire carbon, it can be donated by a private individual. That is not a machlokas. Between Rabbi Yossi and the Chacham in our Mishnah, because what does the brisa say? Osan hayamim, on those days when the wood was donated by these various families, noagin b'shas carbon v'shalo b'shas carbon. According to the Tanakama, the Brisa, they would be knowing that these days were days of celebration, whether it was the time of bringing karbanos, meaning whether there was a Beis HaMikdash, or even after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. Even after that point in time, still these families celebrated these days as Yamim Tovim. Rabbi Yossi Omer, the Brisa continues that Rabbi Yossi says, Eina nohagin el b'shas carbon bilvad. These days are only Yamim Tovim at the time that karbonos are brought, meaning at the time that there is a Beis HaMikdash. The Brisa says, further skipping these next few words, Amar Rabbi Elazar bei Rabbi Tzadok. Rabbi Elazar bei Rabbi Tzadok says, Anu hayinu mibnei Sana ben Binyamin. We actually descend from the family of Sana ben Binyamin, meaning we are one of these families that has a special day when we donated wood to the Beis HaMikdash. V'chal Tisha B'av lios b'Shabbos, and there was 1 year where Tisha B'av fell out on Shabbos. V'dachinu osol l'Motzai Shabbos, so Tisha B'av was pushed to the next day, to Motzai Shabbos, to Sunday. V'hayinu misanin v'lo mashlimin, and we did celebrate it, even though the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. We celebrated as a yontiv because we fasted that day, but we didn't finish the fast. Because for us, the 10th of Av was the day of donating the wood to the Ma'aracha, and therefore it's a bit of a yomtiv, so we don't complete the fast on that particular day. And the Gemara over here is proving from this brisa that everybody agrees when it comes to machshire carbon, like the wood that is being used on the Mizbeach, it is perfectly fine to be donated by a private individual. That's what you see from this brisa. Even Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Tzadok, who is from the Rabbanan, not necessarily the position of Rabbi Yossi, holds that they would donate the wood privately and that this was a day of celebration for these families. The Gemara continues, again skipping a few words in accordance with the Gra. The Gemara continues, Tamon Taninon. We learned over there in a Mishnah in Mesechet Menachos as follows: Kol karbonos hayachid v'atzibor, all karbonos, whether they're individual, whether they're public, when it comes to carbon mincha, boin min haaretz umin chutz laaretz. You could bring it from grain that grows in Eretz Yisrael, or from grain that grows in chutz laaretz, min hachodesh umin hayashin. It could be from the new grain, it could be from the old grain. Chutz min haomer u'shtei halechem, except for the minchas haomer and except for the shtei halechem, she'ein boin elam min hachodesh. Those can only come from the new grain, umin haaretz, and they can only come from Eretz Yisrael. And the Gemara says, Rabbi Chona b'shem Rabbi Yirmiyah to Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Chona says in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, this is actually Rabbi Yishmael's position. To Rabbi Yishmael Omer, because Rabbi Yishmael said, Ein ha'omer ba min ha-Surya. You're not allowed to bring the Omer from Surya. Surya was an area near Eretz Yisrael that is somewhat like Eretz Yisrael, somewhat like Chutz Laaretz. So if he's saying it can't come from Surya, for sure it cannot come from Eretz Yisrael. The Gemara continues, Tamon Taninan, we learned in a Mishnah over there. This is a Mishnah Mesechet Shekalim. It says, Eser Kedushos Hein, there are 10 levels of Kedusha. Eretz Yisrael Mekudeshus Mikol Ha'aratzos. It says that Eretz Yisrael is holier than all other lands. Umahi Kedushasa, what is the holiness of Eretz Yisrael? Shemevian Mimeno Ha'omer V'Habikurim U'Shtei Halechem. You bring from Eretz Yisrael the Omer, you bring Bikurim, you bring the Shtei Halechem. Masha'ein Mevian Kain Mikol Ha'aratzos. That's not true when it comes to other lands. And the Gemara says, Rabbi Chona b'shem Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Yishmael, again, Rabbi Chona says in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, this follows the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, to Rabbi Yishmael Omer, because Rabbi Yishmael says, Ein ha'omer ba min ha-Surya, again, the Omer is not allowed to be brought from grain from Surya. And the Gemara continues, Tamon Taninan, we learned in a Mishnah over there. This is a Mishnah in Mesechet Shvius. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Rabbi Yishmael says, Machorish Rishus, just like the plowing that is forbidden in the Shemitah year is plowing that is a Rishus, plowing that is not a mitzvah. Avkotze Rishus, so too the harvesting that is forbidden in the Shemitah year is referring to specifically to harvesting that is not a mitzvah, that is voluntary. Yotza Katsir HaOmer Shu Mitzvah. This excludes harvesting for the sake of the Omer. When you harvest for the Omer, that already is a mitzvah, and that is permitted in the Shemitah year. And the Gemara says, Rabbi Yishmael Kedaite, Rabbi Yishmael here follows his opinion somewhere else, the opinion we just quoted earlier. To Rabbi Yishmael, Da'amar Ein HaOmer Ba Min HaSurya. Because what does Rabbi Yishmael say? Rabbi Yishmael says you're not allowed to bring the Omer from Surya. In other words, you have to bring the Omer from Eretz Yisrael, where the laws of Shemitah are in place. That follows his opinion over here that the Ketzir HaOmer, the harvesting you do for the sake of the Karban Omer, that is a mitzvah, and that's what you're allowed to do during the Shemitah year. In other words, you have to bring the Omer from Eretz Yisrael, where the laws of Shemitah are in place, and since it's a mitzvah to harvest for the Omer, there's no problem doing that in the Shemitah year, because again, there's no prohibition of Ketzira if that Ketzira is a mitzvah. And the Gemara continues, Mantana Shomrei Svichis Beshvias Notlin Schorin Mitrumas Alishka. Who is the Tana that says that those people who are watching the Svichin, again, they're watching the stuff that grows on its own in Shemitah year, that they get paid from the Trumas Alishka? You have to pay them from those public funds. Gemara says, Rabbi Yishmael, that also follows the position of Rabbi Yishmael, because again, what does Rabbi Yishmael say? Rabbi Yishmael says that you have to take the Omer from Eretz Yisrael. You can't even take it from Syria, and therefore, in this particular situation, in a Shemitah year, you're going to have a problem unless you pay them from the public funds. If you pay them from the public funds, then you don't have an issue that they're taking from Hefker produce, and it's going to be considered private. It's going to be a private individual. It's going to be a problem to bring a public carbon. No, the way you get around that, again, is you pay them from the Trumas Alishka. Now it becomes public. Again, that all follows Rabbi Yishmael's opinion that you have to take the grain from Eretz Yisrael. But the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yossi says, Divrei HaKol, no, really that follows everybody. Everybody agrees that you pay them from these public funds, so why can't you just bring it from Syria? The Gemara explains, Lo matzu b'Syria, because let's say you don't find any grain in Syria, so mevi'in son misvichen sheberetz Yisrael. Then you bring it from the Svichen Eretz Yisrael. In other words, of course, it could be you are allowed technically to bring it from Syria, but it's possible you won't find any in Syria. It's possible you'll need to bring from Eretz Yisrael, and in those situations, of course, you're going to need to pay them from the public funds so that it's not going to be a donation from a private individual. And the Gemara now asks, Hahein Omer, when it comes to the Omer, let's say there is no barley around, you don't have any barley that grew on its own, are you allowed to plant barley during the Shemitah year for the sake of the Karban Omer? The Gemara continues, Rabbi Chia Barada boy kumi Rabbi Mana. Rabbi Chia Barada asked in front of Rabbi Mana, he said, how could you possibly plant the barley in a Shemitah year for the Karban Omer? Lo nimtza kekometz ala shirayim she'ein necholin. Isn't that going to be a problem of taking a kometz on shirayim that can't be eaten? In other words, if you were to actually plant these seeds of barley in the Shemitah year, that would be not edible. You wouldn't be allowed to eat such barley. And there's a problem bringing a carbon when you take the kometz from a carbon on shirayim that aren't allowed to be eaten. That's not considered a proper kmitza, so it won't be a proper Karban Omer. So isn't that a problem of, again, what we call kometz al shirayim she'ein necholim? So the Gemara answers, it's not a problem. Amar Lei said to him, Naasa kechamisha dvarim shein boin betumah ve'ein necholim betumah. It's no different than the 5 things which you bring betumah, but you're not allowed to eat betumah. In other words, when it comes to the Karban Omer and the Shtei HaLechem, those are counted among 5 things that you can bring them as a carbon when you're tameh, even though you won't be able to eat it in that same state of tumah. So therefore, it's exactly the same thing. That's also a situation where you can't eat it. You're not allowed to eat the shirayim, but that's not a problem. That doesn't pass the carbon. The same thing is true over here. It's possible that you'd be allowed to plant the barley in the Shemitah year, even though you wouldn't be able to eat the shirayim. That wouldn't necessarily pass the Karban Mincha, and therefore this is a legitimate question whether you're allowed to do the Zriya in the Shemitah year for the sake of the Karban Omer. And the Gemara leaves this as a question, and the Gemara moves on to the exact process of paying these people who are either guarding the grain, the barley for the Karban Omer, or the people who are doing the harvesting. How exactly do you pay them from this money of hektish? So the Gemara says, Keitzad uosa. What does the Gizbar do? Notel mos min ha-shulchani. First, what he does is he goes to the shulchani, he goes to the money changer, he borrows some money, v'nosin l'kotzrin l'shomrin, and he gives it to the people doing the harvesting, to the people doing the guarding, ad shelo yikrav ha-omer, before the omer is brought. Maybe most mitrumas halishka. Now, once he gets the actual omer, once he gets the actual barley for the karbanas, so then he takes the money from the trumas halishka, that money which is hektish, umechal and olav, and he takes the kedusha from the money, and he's mechal it, he puts it onto the karban omer. Now the kedusha leaves the money and goes onto the karban, and again, then he's going to use that money and pay back the shulchani who he borrowed the money from in the first place. And so the Gemara says, v'tavus kain, is this an appropriate way to be mechal the money? What the Gemara is presumably asking over here is that the value of the Karban Omer is far less than the amount of money he's taking out of the Trumas Halishka, which ultimately was being used to pay all the people who were protecting the grain, all the people who were harvesting the grain. How could you mechalel such a small a carbon of such small value on so much money? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Acha b'shem Rabbi Ba. Rabbi Acha says the name of Rabbi Ba. Kol ma sheyitin hein heim damav mishar rishona. All that he is giving towards the Omer, that was the original value. In other words, you take the Omer and you say, the value of this Omer really includes within it all of that money that needs to be paid to harvest it, that needs to be paid to protect it. All of that is included in the value of this Karban Omer. And the Gemara continues along the same lines. Tana was taught, it works exactly the same way when it comes to paying the people who cut the stones for the building of the Beis HaMikdash. It's exactly the same thing. So what does he do? Notel mos mishalchani. Again, the Gizbor takes money from the Shalchani. He takes it from the money changer, Venosin, L'chotzvin, U'Lesatasin. He gives it to those people who are cutting the stones, shaping the stones. Ad Shalotinazin al Gabe Hadimos. All of this is done before you actually start building with the stones. Umishanitan al Adimos. And now, when you take these stones and you put them on the dimos, in other words, when you take them and you start arranging them in rows for building purposes, so then maybe mos mitrumas halishka. Then he brings money from the trumas halishka, this money that has kedusha. Umechalin oleh. And again, he does the exact same thing. He takes the kedusha from the money and puts it, so to speak, onto the stones. These stones are now kadosh, part of the Beis HaMikdash. Gemara says the same thing. V'tavas kain, is that really appropriate? You're taking far more money than the stones are actually worth, and you're being mechalel, the kedusha from that money, on the stones. And the Gemara gives the same answer. Rabbi Yossi bei Rabbi Bon b'shem Shmuel. Rabbi Yossi says in the name of Shmuel as follows: Kalma sheyitein hein dameh mishar rishona. The money that you're giving, that was the value all along, because in other words, the stone is not just worth the value of a stone; it's worth all of the labor that goes into producing that stone. That's all part of the value of the stone. That's why you're allowed to take this money and be mechal of the kedusha upon the stone. In this fashion, we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Amud Beis.